Hi, my name is Evelyn Soltero, and I'm here to present to you how you could be a better steward of your groundwater resources. To get started, we need to talk a little bit about surface water, groundwater connectivity. This first slide you'll see is of a local creek, and alongside that creek is a riparian habitat. That habitat is important to the interconnectivity, the health of the surface water and groundwater relationship. If this feature were on my property and I were to throw down some gravel to create a parking spot, or to put down a cement pad to build my gazebo right next to the creek, or maybe I even needed a little exercise for my kid and I created a basketball pad on which they could play. That activity in a riparian habitat directly and negatively impacts surface water, groundwater connectivity, and negatively impacts infiltration to the surrounding groundwater wells. So let's jumpstart fractured rock wells and what you need to know. My business, all about wells, and my contact information. Please feel free to contact me. I'm happy to chat. I've introduced a few questions here for us to entertain in the next few minutes, and they are: how does water enter into your well? And how could you support hyperlocal infiltration, or infiltration in and around your property, through surface water, groundwater connectivity? This next slide is that of a natural waterway, and certainly we see the surface water in that channel, but what we may not recognize is that there is a groundwater strata below that river channel that's interconnected in a healthy ecological setting. So let's talk about surface water and groundwater for a minute. Many of us could easily define surface water as water found in streams, rivers, lakes, and oceans, and recognize that surface water is replenished by precipitation, rain and snow. But there's another important thing about the connectivity between surface water and groundwater, and that is that groundwater recharges surface water late in the season. In a healthy setting, excess groundwater will discharge into a local channel and provide us with our perennial streams. Now, groundwater, as we know, is water below the strata, below the subsurface, collected in soil spaces and pores, in fractures, to the point of saturation such that we've created a water table. And that we likely understand easy enough that groundwater is replenished by surface water. But groundwater in excess and in healthy connective setting can also surface as wetlands, seeps, and springs. So addressing that, how do you think groundwater actually enters into your well? I'd like to talk about what happens in that stream channel throughout the season. During the wet season, that stream is known as a losing stream, in that water in that channel infiltrates to the broader area and the surrounding subsurface. During a dry season, if there's a healthy surface water, groundwater connectivity, groundwater will upwell in excess and enter into that stream, thereby contributing to a perennial year-round creek or river. And here's a cutaway to show you yet again how surface water and groundwater are interconnected. This stream or river is meandering across the surface, but below its feet, if I may, there is a strata, a bed, if I may, of groundwater, collected saturated groundwater. Now, why is that important? Many of us appreciate surface water features in and around our land, and we may divert or remove some of that water to create a pond. And the important part of that is to recognize that by diverting or otherwise storing surface water out of its normal channel, you are directly impacting its connection to the groundwater below its feet. So understanding that surface water and groundwater are interconnected should help you understand that maintaining a healthy surface water riparian habitat feature in and around your land actually supports your groundwater production and your groundwater presence. There are two types of aquifers, one of which has been defined by the state of California. Those two types are alluvial aquifer, that is which defined by the state of California, and a fractured rock aquifer, that type of aquifer that we find here in the Sierra foothills. An alluvial aquifer is a band of water, a river below our feet, if I may, that travels through sand and gravel for extended lengths throughout the subsurface. And that alluvial aquifer is recharged through infiltration from a forest edge, or from a meadow that infiltrates and collects into a saturated zone and then is economically viable for us to pump. The fractured rock aquifer has fractures in bedrock of unknown orientation, of unknown depth, and unknown connectivity. There's a much more random feature to a fractured rock aquifer. So much less is known that 1 out of 5 wells could easily be drilled dry. In this particular slide, there is a well mocked up to the right of this fractured rock scenario, and there are 3 zones that are depicted, A, B, and C. Zone A is known as your unsaturated zone, a zone through which water travels and has yet to collect in your pore space, but there's rocks and gravel and other organisms through which that water travels as it enters into Zone B. Zone B is a zone of aeration, where there's more water collecting, but there's also an equal mix of air and other particulate matter in that matrix. And then Zone C is a saturated zone, which your fractures may or may not enter into seasonally. Now, were I to get to pumping, I could easily deplete Zone C and run out of enough water to enter into my well and provide me with the quantity I'm requesting. And in doing so, I'm going to begin to withdraw water from Zone B. In doing that, I would notice a quality change in my water. Say I'm watering a fruit tree and I'm doing laundry because it's Saturday. I happen to go get a glass of water and I notice that my water has changed color and or it's become cloudy. If that's the case, I would hope that you would recognize you're beginning to exceed your available water in your well and you'd put everything to rest for a good few days before you began to water again. It's important to recognize this interconnectivity so that we don't draw down our wells. This next slide is a slide of a visible fracture on a road cut. And what I'd like you to notice about this slide is that if it were raining or snowing, that precipitation would enter into those fractures that are visible to the roadside, and that water would be carried into the bedrock below and contribute to groundwater production. I think that many of us don't recognize our well as our daily driver. We're familiar with our cars. If we turn on our car and it makes a certain noise, we may be likely to pop the hood or scratch our head and say, oh, that's different. We know where our oil is. We make sure to get it changed. We are familiar with our fan belt, our radiator. But how many of you have actually gone out to your well house and popped open that door and taken a look at what's under the hood of your well? I would encourage you to do so. How do you operate your well? Does your well run dry frequently? Are you constantly in drawdown mode? Have you noticed a drop in performance? As you open that door to your well house, is your well system in good shape? Is your equipment exhausted and tired, or shiny brass tack style? Do you have a holding tank, even if your well is wealthy? I think it's important to recognize that each well has its own personality and likely experiences seasonal variability. This diagram is to encourage you to go out to your well house and create your own diagram. I'd like you to take a look at that plumbing and see if you can't figure out where things go and how water gets to your house through the current system that you have. In this diagram, you'll see a mocked up well system, a pump in the ground, a static water level, and that static water level is where your water rests within your borehole, and that static water level can change seasonally. There's a pumping level based on how deep your pump sits, and again, where is your static water level. You have a total pumping head. You may pump from the bottom of your well all the way up to a holding tank on the hill. You may pump only to a pressure tank that then pressurizes your house. I would encourage you to go out to your well house and diagram what system you have. There's another term in here, and that's drawdown, and I've thrown that out a few times, and I want to talk about that. Drawdown is when we as well operators are pumping more water than is coming into the well. We're beginning to exceed our available groundwater capacity. And in doing so, we draw in sand and silt and sediment and grit, and as I mentioned earlier, could certainly impact our available water quality and obviously our available water quantity. But what's important when we operate in drawdown mode is the damage that we're doing. It's important to understand the damage that we're doing. All of that material is being drawn into your pump and beginning to pack itself against the screen and causing that motor to work really hard. But even more critically is as you're drawing that sand and silt and sediment and grit through the formation, you're beginning to occlude or reduce the aperture that pipes that water to your well. So essentially, you're impacting your available groundwater. You also, if you continue to operate in drawdown, can create a cone of depression. And that cone of depression can extend to your neighbor's well and your neighbor's well, such that you, with your overpumping activity, are drawing water or drawing down groundwater in a greater, more regional setting. And yes, and vice versa, your neighbor can also turn on their well and begin to impact your available water. Now, I think at this point it's important to begin to understand that your well is unique and what you may need to know about your well to help support infiltration and to try and figure out how your well may be receiving its water. Every well that's drilled, every well driller that goes out and drills a well creates a well report or a well log. Those logs and reports are available through Department of Water Resources, through your local well drillers, or through your county records. They're public information. I would encourage you to determine or to go ahead and seek out your well report and your neighbors as well. What does that well report tell you? It tells you how deep your well is, the date it was drilled, in the height of a storm or in August of a drought. It tells you the geology that well was drilled through. It tells you your number of fractures and whether or not they were water bearing and how deep they are. It tells you your static water level at that point in time when the well was drilled. And it tells you whether or not that well was lined, which gives you an idea of how fragile that hydrogeologic formation may be. Knowing that information allows you to address features like permeability of your aquifer, porosity of your land. I've asked you to consider how water may get into your well. Consider how water interacts with your land. Do you have high surface runoff? Do you have standing water? Do you have water that infiltrates so quickly that you actually never see any water on your surface of your land at all, even in a downpour? And so those things are important because knowing a wee bit about your well construction, correlating that with how surface water interacts with your land, allows you to be a better steward and to start to direct your land management to improve your groundwater production and presence of. And for those of you that may wish a little bit of definition around porosity and permeability, porosity is simply the space between, or the pore space between the material in the matrix, between the rocks, the sand, the gravel, the sediment, the silt. The permeability relates to how fast water moves through those pore spaces. So not only am I asking you how do you think water gets into your well, but how could you support your local infiltration? Many of us are familiar, especially in this current culture, about being fire safe. I'd like to tie in being groundwater wise. Take a look around your property and ask yourself how surface water interacts with your property and how that might benefit and recharge to your well. Consider that you could work with that surface water on your property to slow it down through mulch and chip, to spread it so that it has time to not insize or create erosion, and to sink it. I would rather have that water leave through your geology than as runoff over the surface of your property. So encourage infiltration. Walk around your property in the dead of a rain in the heat of August and try to determine where infiltration may occur on your land. If you're recognizing and identifying these pieces, these areas on your property, value that you don't want to build a gazebo there. The kids' basketball court can go somewhere else, and your parking can be a little further away. Again, if you can, identify and reduce your unnatural runoff. Eliminate compaction, at least reduce the areas around your land that are compacted, and encourage infiltration. Recognize that if you live with the well, you are interconnected with the local hydrologic system. Slow it, spread it, sink it. Surface water and groundwater are interconnected. I really want to thank you for supporting your well, and please feel free to contact me if you have any questions.